Close your eyes and imagine yourself in an ancient vineyard as the sun sets over hills heavy with grapes. The day's harvest is ending and workers are leaving the fields, their songs fading into the cooler evening air. The vines stretch endlessly in neat rows, their leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. You can smell the sweet, intoxicating scent of crushed grapes, that deep purple-red aroma that speaks of transformation and fermentation, of juice becoming something more. Somewhere in the distance, drums beat softly, rhythmically, like a heartbeat slowing into sleep. A flute plays a melody that seems to come from the earth itself. The last light catches on clusters of grapes, making them glow like jewels, like offerings to some unseen presence. You feel the soil beneath your feet, rich and dark, where countless generations have grown these sacred vines. The air grows cooler, the purple sky deepens to indigo, and stars begin to appear. This is the threshold hour when day transforms into night, when work becomes rest, when the ordinary world gives way to something wilder, stranger, more mysterious. In this liminal moment, you can almost sense a presence in the vineyard. Ancient, joyful, dangerous, divine. The God of the vine watches over this transformation, as he has watched over all transformation since time began. Rest now, let the wine-dark night embrace you, and journey with us into the fascinating, ecstatic world of Dionysus, the twice-born god who taught humanity that sometimes we must lose ourselves completely to truly find what we are. The twice-born god, a divine paradox. The story of Dionysus begins with a paradox that defined his entire existence. He was both fully divine and touched by mortality, both legitimately Olympian and forever marked as an outsider, both dead and reborn, both male and female in the manner of his birth. No other Greek god embodied quite so many contradictions, and perhaps that's why Dionysus became the god of transformation, of boundaries crossed, of identities dissolved and reformed. His mother was Semele, a mortal princess of Thebes, daughter of Cadmus, who founded that great city, and of Harmonia herself, the child of Ares and Aphrodite. Semele was beautiful, young, and devout. She served as a priestess at Zeus's altar. It was there, according to most traditions, that Zeus first noticed her, watching as she performed her duties with grace and reverence. The king of gods, never famous for resisting attraction, descended from Olympus and entered into an affair with Semele. The relationship was kept secret, as Zeus's extramarital adventures always had to be, given Hera's legendary jealousy. But secrets involving Zeus had a way of being discovered, and Hera, queen of the gods, protector of marriage, and deeply wounded by her husband's countless infidelities, learned of Semele's pregnancy. What followed was not the immediate divine violence Hera might have unleashed on other lovers. Instead, she devised something far more cruel and clever. Hera disguised herself as an old woman, perhaps Semele's childhood nurse Beroe, someone the princess would trust without question. In this guise, she befriended Semele, gaining her confidence, listening to her hopes and fears about the divine child she carried. Hera played her role perfectly, acting as a supportive friend while planting seeds of doubt. She expressed wonder at Semele's good fortune, then casually mentioned how she herself had never actually seen a god in their true form. Had Semele? Was she absolutely certain that her lover was Zeus, king of gods, and not some trickster pretending to be him? The doubt took root and grew. Semele began to wonder, how did she know for certain? Zeus had appeared to her as a man, handsome and powerful. Yes, but how could she be sure of his true divinity? The more she thought about it, the more uncertainty gnawed at her. Finally, Semele decided she needed proof. She would ask Zeus to reveal himself in his full divine glory, in the same form he showed to his wife Hera. Zeus, deeply in love with Semele, had made the fatal mistake of swearing by the river Styx, the most unbreakable oath a god could make, that he would grant her any wish. When Semele asked to see his true form, Zeus understood immediately what would happen. He begged her to reconsider, to ask for anything else, but she insisted. And an oath sworn on the Styx could not be broken, not even by the king of gods. Zeus appeared before Semele in his full divine radiance, crowned with thunderbolts and surrounded by celestial fire. The power was too great for any mortal to withstand. Semele was consumed instantly, burned to ash by the overwhelming force of divine presence. The palace chamber where she stood became an inferno. Everything mortal about her was destroyed in an instant, but the child in her womb, that child was half divine, Zeus's own son, and divinity cannot be so easily destroyed. In the moment of Semele's death, Zeus acted. He plunged into the flames and rescued the 6-month-old fetus from his lover's burning body. Then, in one of the most bizarre acts in all of mythology, Zeus performed an emergency measure that would make his son unique among gods. He cut open his own thigh and sewed the premature infant inside. For the next 3 months, Zeus himself carried his son to term, experiencing something no male god or mortal had ever experienced: pregnancy. The king of gods became both father and mother to his child. Some artistic depictions show Zeus's thigh visibly swollen. Others show the baby visible through the divine flesh. It must have been uncomfortable, possibly painful, certainly undignified for the supreme deity. But Zeus endured it, protecting his son in his own body, the way Semele had protected him in hers. When the proper time came, Zeus loosened the stitches and gave birth. The child emerged from his father's thigh, fully developed, ready to live. Because of this double gestation, first in his mother's womb, then in his father's thigh, the baby was named Dionysus, and he was forever known by the epithet Demeter, meaning of 2 mothers, or more commonly, the twice-born god. This bizarre birth story wasn't just mythological creativity. It carried profound symbolic weight. Dionysus had died before being born, consumed by fire in Semele's womb, and then been resurrected. Death and rebirth were written into his very origin story, foreshadowing his role as a dying and rising god in Orphic tradition. He had been carried by both female and male parents, blurring gender boundaries in a way no other Olympian god did. He was both mortal-born and god-born, both killed by divine power and saved by it, both destroyed and remade. After his unusual birth, Zeus knew the infant Dionysus needed protection from Hera, who hadn't given up her vendetta. He entrusted the baby to Hermes, who carried the divine child, to Mount Nysa, mountain whose exact location was deliberately vague in Greek mythology, sometimes placed in Thrace, sometimes in India, sometimes in Arabia or Egypt. The vagueness was intentional. Nysa was a mythical place, existing somewhat outside normal geography, a liminal space suitable for raising a liminal god. On Mount Nysa, Dionysus was given to the nymphs who lived there to nurse and raise. These nymphs, called the Nysiads, became his nurses and early companions. In some versions, though a satyr Silenus, who would become Dionysus's lifelong companion and tutor, was also involved in raising the young god. The infant was dressed as a girl to further disguise him from Hera's wrath, adding another layer of gender fluidity to his early life. For a time, the deception worked. Dionysus grew up in the wild mountains, surrounded by nature, nymphs, and gradually discovering his divine powers and his gift to humanity. The cultivation of the grapevine and the production of wine. The ancient sources describe him learning to identify which plants produced the best fruit, how to tend vines, how to press grapes, and ferment their juice into wine. He discovered that this fermented juice had remarkable properties. It could ease pain, bring joy, loosen inhibitions, create feelings of divine possession and transcendence. Wine became his special gift to humanity, his earthly incarnation. But Hera eventually discovered where Dionysus was hidden. Unable to kill him directly, he was, after all, fully divine now, and gods cannot truly die. She did something perhaps worse. She struck him with madness. The same divine madness that would later become one of his defining characteristics. The young god was driven out of his mind, sent wandering across the known world in a maddened state, not knowing who or what he was. This period of divine madness took Dionysus far from Greece, through Thrace, through Phrygia, through Asia Minor, perhaps even to India, according to later traditions. He wandered as both victim and vector of madness, spreading chaos wherever he went, but also gradually understanding and learning to control the maddening power within him. This journey, this period of insanity and wandering, became crucial to his mythology. It explained why Dionysus was seen as a foreign god, why his cult practices came from the east, why he was associated with wild, barbarian lands beyond civilized Greece. In Phrygia, according to the myths, Dionysus was finally healed. The great mother goddess Cybele, whom the Greeks identified with Rhea, mother of the Olympian gods, took pity on the maddened young deity. She purified him, cured his insanity, and taught him her sacred rites. These were ecstatic, orgiastic ceremonies involving wild music, dancing, and altered states of consciousness. Cybele gave Dionysus the framework for his own cult, showing him how divine madness could be channeled, controlled, and used for religious purpose rather than suffered as affliction. The madness that had been his curse became his gift, the tool through which he would offer liberation to his followers. Once cured and initiated into these mysteries, Dionysus was ready to establish his own cult. But he didn't return immediately to Greece. Instead, he continued his travels, spreading knowledge of viticulture and winemaking, teaching people how to grow grapes and make wine, establishing worship centers, and gathering followers. His retinue grew to include not just the nymphs who had raised him and Silenus, his old tutor, but also satyrs, those half-man, half-goat creatures associated with wild nature and sexual license, and human followers, particularly women who would become his famous maenads. When Dionysus finally did return to Greece to claim his place among the Olympian gods, he came as a mature deity, fully aware of his powers, leading a wild train of followers, and demanding recognition, not as a suppliant, but as a conqueror. The resistance he met from various Greek kings and cities who refused to acknowledge a foreign god became the subject of numerous myths. These resistance stories, which we'll explore in more detail later, always ended the same way. Those who opposed Dionysus were driven mad, destroyed, torn apart. the twice-born god would not be denied his divine rights. Zeus eventually welcomed his son to Olympus, making Dionysus one of the 12 Olympian gods, despite his half-mortal origins. This was extraordinary. Heracles had to die and be reborn to achieve godhood despite being Zeus's son. Yet Dionysus was accepted while still carrying the mark of his mortal mother's death and his own impossible rebirth. Some traditions say Dionysus even rescued Semele from the underworld later, bringing her to Olympus where Zeus made her immortal under a new name, Thyone. The birth story of Dionysus established all the themes that would define him: death and rebirth, the blurring of boundaries between male and female, mortal and divine, Greek and foreign, madness and sanity, persecution and ultimate triumph, destruction leading to transformation. He was the god who had died before living, who had been both in his mother's womb and his father's thigh, who had been mad and been cured, who had wandered foreign lands and returned home a conqueror. The twice-born god embodied paradox, transformation, and the dissolution of fixed identities. And he brought these same gifts of transformation and dissolution to those who worshipped him. From Anatolia to Greece, the foreign god arrives. One of the most fascinating aspects of Dionysus in Greek mythology is that despite being the son of Zeus, the king of the Olympian gods, the most Greek of all Greek deities, Dionysus himself was persistently characterized as foreign, as coming from outside, as bringing strange and unsettling practices from barbaric lands to the east. This apparent contradiction wasn't a mistake or confusion. In the myths, it was essential to understanding who Dionysus was and what he represented. The ancient Greeks themselves recognized Dionysus's foreign origins, while they placed his conception and initial birth in Thebes, a thoroughly Greek city. They consistently described his upbringing, his education in divine mysteries, and the source of his cult practices as coming from Thrace and Phrygia, regions that classical Greeks considered barbarous, uncivilized, frighteningly other. This foreignness wasn't incidental. It was crucial to Dionysus's power and meaning. The historical reality behind this mythological foreignness is complex and reveals much about how Greek religion actually developed over centuries of cultural contact and exchange. Archaeological and linguistic evidence suggests that worship of a deity recognizable as Dionysus existed in the Mycenaean period, around 1400 BCE. Linear B tablets, the earliest Greek writing, contain the name Dionysus, written as Dionyso, proving that some form of his cult was present in Greece at that very early date. So Dionysus wasn't actually a late arrival, wasn't actually foreign in the way the myth suggested. He was as ancient in Greece as Zeus himself, perhaps even older, his worship stretching back into the dimness before writing, before even the great Bronze Age palaces arose. Why then did the Greeks consistently portray him as coming from outside? Why did they insist on his foreign origins despite evidence of his ancient presence in their land? The answer lies in what Dionysus represented and in the actual origins of many of his cult practices. While a god named Dionysus may have been worshipped in Greece from very early times, the ecstatic, orgiastic religious practices associated with him did come from Anatolia and Thrace. They were imports, foreign rituals that spread into Greece during the Archaic period and were eventually incorporated into Greek religion by being attached to an already existing god. The process reveals something fascinating about religious evolution. The Greeks didn't invent Dionysian ecstasy from nothing, nor did they simply adopt a foreign god wholesale. Instead, they had an ancient deity associated with wine and vegetation, and when they encountered similar but more extreme religious practices among their neighbors to the north and east, they understood these as different expressions of the same divine force. The wild mountain dances, the possession states, the ritual violence, these came from outside, but they were grafted onto an existing religious framework, creating something new from the synthesis of indigenous and foreign elements. Thrace, the region north of Greece encompassing parts of modern Bulgaria, Turkey, and Greece, was home to wild, ecstatic religious practices involving music, dance, intoxication, and altered states of consciousness. The Thracians were Indo-European people like the Greeks, but they remained tribal and less urbanized, living in mountain villages and maintaining older, more primal religious forms that the increasingly civilized Greeks had begun to leave behind. Their land was harsh and beautiful, high mountains cut by deep valleys, dense forests that had never been cleared, wild rivers rushing down from snow-capped peaks. This was landscape that shaped religion, terrain where the divine felt close, dangerous, immediate. The Thracians worshipped a god of vegetation and wine, whom they identified with the Greeks' Dionysus, or perhaps more accurately, whom the Greeks identified with their Dionysus when they encountered him. This Thracian deity was associated with wild nature, with the mountains and forests, with the raw power of growing things and changing seasons. Thracian religion was shamanic in character, involving practitioners who entered trance states to communicate with spirits, who used music and rhythmic movement to induce possession, who understood religion as direct encounter with supernatural forces rather than distant worship of gods in temples. When Greek traders and colonists encountered Thracian religious practices, they were both fascinated and disturbed. The Thracians danced for hours on mountaintops, their movements growing wilder as drums beat ceaselessly. They consumed substances, wine certainly, but probably other intoxicants as well, plants and mushrooms that grew in their forests, to alter consciousness and facilitate divine communication. Their priestesses prophesied while possessed, speaking in voices not their own. Their ceremonies involved blood sacrifice, frenzied movement, sexual elements that shocked Greek observers. Yet there was also something compelling about it, something that touched desires the Greeks themselves felt but had learned to suppress or regulate within more civilized religious forms. Even more influential was Phrygia, a region in central Anatolia, modern Turkey, that had its own powerful tradition of ecstatic religion centered on the mother goddess Cybele. The Phrygians had migrated from Thrace centuries earlier, carrying their religious traditions with them and adapting them to their new homeland. In the mountains of Anatolia, they carved sanctuaries directly into living rock, creating shrine facades that emerged from the cliff faces, as if the stone itself had given birth to sacred space. These rock-cut monuments, decorated with geometric patterns and images of the goddess, were places where the boundary between natural and supernatural seemed thin, where stone spoke and the Earth Mother revealed herself. Cybele worship involved drums, cymbals, wild dancing, and states of religious frenzy that made Greek Dionysian worship seem almost tame by comparison. Her priests, the Galli, were eunuchs who had castrated themselves in moments of divine possession, cutting away their manhood in an imitation of Otis, Cybele's beloved, who had performed the same act before bleeding to death under a pine tree. This extreme devotion, this willingness to destroy one's own body for the goddess, both horrified and fascinated the Greeks. It represented religious commitment taken to an absolute extreme, surrender of self to divine will made literal in the most shocking way possible. The Phrygian Cybele was called Matar, simply mother, and her worship centered on acknowledging her as source of all life, all growth, all fertility in earth and animal and human. She was the mountain itself made divine, the rocky landscape personified, the wild, untamed nature of Anatolia embodied in female form. Lions were her sacred animals, not domesticated cats, but the great predators that once roamed Anatolian mountains, fierce and beautiful and deadly. She was depicted riding lions or flanked by them, showing her mastery over the most dangerous forces of wild nature, her ability to channel and direct what would otherwise destroy humanity. Her rituals took place on mountainsides at night, with torches illuminating faces made strange by flickering light and ecstatic movement. Drums called timpana beat rhythmically, their sound echoing off rock faces, creating layered reverberations that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Cymbals crashed together, sharp, metallic sounds cutting through the drum beats. Flutes played melodies that rose and fell, mimicking the crying of mountain birds and the howling of wind through ravines. The music was designed to be hypnotic, repetitive, insistent, gradually overwhelming rational thought, and opening participants to possession by the goddess. Dancers moved to this music for hours, their movements growing increasingly frenzied. As the night progressed, they would leap and spin, throw their heads back, cry out in voices not quite their own. Some would fall into trance states, rigid or convulsing, speaking prophecies or simply making sounds, groans, screams, inhuman noises. Others would grab knives and cut themselves, blood flowing freely but seemingly without pain, demonstrating that the goddess had taken over their bodies, that they no longer felt ordinary physical sensations. The most devoted might castrate themselves in these moments, driven by religious fervor beyond any rational restraint. When Greeks colonized the western coast of Anatolia and came into contact with Phrygian culture, they encountered these Cybele rites and found them both fascinating and disturbing. The practices were nothing like the orderly sacrifices and hymns of traditional Greek religion. Greek worship typically involved public ceremonies in daylight, animal sacrifices performed by priests following precise rituals, hymns and prayers delivered in measured forms, everyone maintaining decorum and self-control. Cybele worship was its opposite: nighttime, mountainous, ecstatic, violent, producing altered states where self-control vanished and something else took over. They were raw, emotional, physical, ecstatic, designed to break down rational control and induce direct communion with the divine through madness and possession. Greek traders, colonists, and travelers brought stories of these strange rites back to mainland Greece, and gradually, these foreign practices became associated with Dionysus. The connection made theological sense. Both Cybele and Dionysus represented wild nature. Both used music and ecstatic dance. Both involved possession and altered consciousness. Both had connections to death and rebirth. The emotional content of the worship felt similar, even if the specific deities were different. Greeks who had experienced or witnessed Cybele rites and then encountered Dionysian worship would have recognized kindred religious impulses, similar techniques for reaching divine consciousness. The mythological explanation for this connection was the story we've already discussed. Dionysus, driven mad by Hera, wandered through Thrace and Phrygia, where Cybele cured him and taught him her mysteries. This myth provided a divine pedigree for practices that were actually being imported through human cultural contact. By having Dionysus learn from Cybele, the Greeks explained how their god came to preside over these strange, foreign rituals. The Greeks also identified Dionysus with other foreign gods. In Phrygia, there was Sabazios, a sky and fertility god whose worship involved similar ecstatic rites. The Greeks conflated Sabazios with Dionysus, or claimed they were the same deity known by different names. When the Greeks encountered Egyptian religion, they identified Dionysus with Osiris, the Egyptian god of death and rebirth who was dismembered and resurrected, a parallel that would become important in Orphic tradition. Similar identifications were made with Phoenician Adonis, Arabian Orotalt, and various other vegetation and death rebirth deities across the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. All of these identifications reinforced Dionysus's character as a god who came from outside, who brought foreign knowledge, who couldn't be contained within traditional Greek religious categories. The Greeks even invented traditions claiming that Dionysus had traveled all the way to India, conquering that distant land and teaching its people about wine. These India campaigns, elaborated in later sources like Nonnus's Dionysiaca, were probably invented to explain the far eastern elements that seemed to cluster around Dionysian worship. The key phrase used to describe Dionysus was the god who comes, or the arriving god. This epithet captured something essential about him. Dionysus was a god of epiphany, of sudden appearance, of arrival from elsewhere. He didn't sit enthroned on Olympus like Zeus, or dwell in temples like Apollo. Instead, he came suddenly, unexpectedly, often violently, breaking into communities and demanding recognition. His arrival disrupted normal life, overturned social orders, drove people into states of possession and madness. You didn't seek out Dionysus. Dionysus came to you, and when he came, nothing was ever the same. This pattern of arrival and disruption was enacted dramatically in the resistance myths, stories of Greek kings and cities that refused to accept Dionysus's divinity. The most famous of these is the story of Pentheus, king of Thebes, Dionysus's own hometown. Euripides' play, The Bacchae, one of the greatest tragedies of ancient Greece, tells this story in horrifying detail. Pentheus was Dionysus's cousin, both being descendants of Cadmus. When Dionysus returned to Thebes to establish his worship, Pentheus refused to acknowledge him as a god. Pentheus saw Dionysus's rites as disgusting, effeminate, foreign corruption. He saw the Maenads, the women followers who left their homes to dance on mountains in religious frenzy, as engaging in sexual orgies and abandoning their proper roles. He saw Dionysus himself as a suspiciously feminine foreigner with long curls and soft features, not a proper masculine Greek deity at all. Pentheus tried to imprison Dionysus, tried to forbid the women of Thebes from participating in his rites, tried to reassert masculine rational control over what he saw as dangerous female irrationality. Every attempt failed. Dionysus freed himself effortlessly. The women couldn't be controlled. They went to the mountains anyway, possessed by the god, performing impossible feats of strength. Finally, Dionysus offered Pentheus a chance to spy on these women, to see what they were really doing, and Pentheus, driven by prurient curiosity and masculine anxiety, agreed. Dionysus dressed Pentheus in women's clothing, another gender transgression, led him to Mount Cithaeron, where the Maenads danced, and then revealed him to the frenzied women. The Maenads, in their divine possession, saw Pentheus not as a man, but as a mountain lion, a threat to be eliminated. Led by Agave, Pentheus's own mother, they tore him limb from limb with their bare hands, performing the ritual act called sparagmos. Agave, still possessed, carried her son's severed head back to Thebes on a stick, believing it to be the head of the lion she had killed. Only gradually did her madness fade, and the horrible reality of what she'd done become clear. Other resistance myths followed similar patterns. King Lycurgus of Thrace attacked Dionysus and his nurses. He was driven mad, killed his own son, believing him to be a grapevine, then tried to cut off his own limbs. His land became barren until his people killed him. The daughters of King Minyas refused to join Dionysian rites, preferring to stay home and weave. Dionysus drove them mad, and they too ended up tearing apart and eating one of their own children. The story was always the same. Oppose Dionysus, and you will be destroyed by the very madness you rejected. These resistance myths weren't just entertaining stories. They were theological statements about what Dionysus represented. He embodied forces that rational, masculine, civilized Greek society wanted to deny or control. Ecstasy, madness, the dissolution of social boundaries, feminine power, the wild nature that civilization tried to suppress. When kings tried to forbid his worship, they were trying to deny these forces, to pretend they didn't exist or could be controlled by laws and masculine authority. Dionysus's violent response demonstrated that such denial was futile and dangerous. The forces he represented couldn't be suppressed. They could only be acknowledged, ritualized, given their proper outlet. Better to worship Dionysus and channel ecstasy and madness into religious ritual than to deny them and have them erupt in uncontrollable violence. The foreignness of Dionysus, then, wasn't really about geography. It was about psychological and social territory. He represented what was outside the boundaries of normal Greek life, the wild versus the civilized, madness versus reason, female power versus male control, nature versus culture, ecstasy versus sobriety. By characterizing him as foreign, as coming from barbaric lands, the Greeks were acknowledging that he brought something fundamentally other, something that couldn't be comfortably integrated into their existing worldview. Yet, integrate him they did. By the classical period, Dionysus was firmly established as one of the 12 Olympian gods. His festivals were among the most important in the Greek religious calendar. The theater of Dionysus in Athens hosted the dramatic competitions that produced some of the greatest works of Western literature. He had temples, priests, official cult practices. The foreign god had been domesticated, his wild rites channeled into civic religion. But something of his essential foreignness, his outsider status, always remained. Even when Greeks worshipped him in the heart of Athens, Dionysus retained his character as the god who comes from elsewhere, who brings disruptive power, who can never be entirely tamed or controlled by civilization. that liminality, that permanent status as both insider and outsider, both Greek and foreign, both civilized and wild, was what made Dionysus so powerful, so necessary, and so dangerous. He was the god at the threshold, or the boundary crosser, eternally arriving from somewhere else to shake the foundations of whatever order thought itself secure. Wine, madness, and liberation. At the heart of Dionysus's cult lay wine, not just as an intoxicating beverage, but as a sacred substance, a direct manifestation of the god himself. The Greeks said that wine was Dionysus's blood, that to drink wine was to consume the god, to take divinity directly into your body. This understanding transformed drinking from a simple pleasure into a religious sacrament, and it made Dionysus fundamentally different from other Greek gods. The mythology credited Dionysus with discovering the grapevine and teaching humanity viticulture, how to grow grapes, how to harvest them, how to press them and ferment their juice. Before Dionysus, according to the myths, humans drank water, milk, perhaps honey mead. Wine was his unique gift, and it was a gift that changed everything. With wine came a substance that could alter consciousness, that could make the sober drunk, the sad joyful, the controlled ecstatic, the rational irrational. Wine dissolved boundaries between oneself and others, between human and divine, between the world as it was and the world as it might be. The Greeks approached wine with a complicated mixture of appreciation and anxiety. In its proper use, diluted with water, drunk in moderation at symposia, accompanied by philosophical discussion, wine was civilized, refined, the drink of educated men. But wine could also be dangerous, leading to violence, sexual excess, loss of control. The Greeks saw both possibilities in Dionysus's gift, both the positive and negative potential of altered consciousness. Dionysian religion, however, embraced the more dangerous aspect. In his cult rituals, wine was drunk unmixed. Drinking undiluted wine was considered barbaric in normal Greek society, and the goal was not moderate enjoyment but complete intoxication. Worshippers sought to become drunk, to lose their ordinary consciousness, because this dissolution of normal awareness was the pathway to experiencing the god. To be drunk was to be possessed by Dionysus, to have him literally flowing through your veins, to become temporarily divine. This brings us to one of the most important concepts in Dionysian worship: divine madness. The Greeks had a specific word for this, mania, from which our English mania derives, but the Greek conception was different from our modern psychiatric understanding. Mania, in Greek thought, was madness sent by a god, a temporary insanity that allowed you to transcend normal human limitations and experience something beyond ordinary consciousness. Different gods could send different types of mania. Apollo sent prophetic mania, the madness that allowed the oracle at Delphi to speak divine truths. The Muses sent poetic mania, the inspiration that allowed poets to create. But Dionysus sent the purest, most complete form of divine madness, an ecstasy that dissolved your entire sense of self and replaced it with divine possession. The Greek word for this ecstasy was ecstasis, which literally means standing outside oneself. When you experienced Dionysian ecstasy, you stood outside your normal identity, outside your social role, outside all the categories and boundaries that normally defined who you were. For the duration of the divine possession, you were no longer yourself. You were taken over by the god, And through that possession, you experienced a liberation from all the constraints of ordinary existence. This ecstasy wasn't metaphorical. The Greeks believed that Dionysus literally entered his worshippers, possessed their bodies, and acted through them. When Maenads tore apart animals with their bare hands in sparagmos rituals, it wasn't the human women performing these acts. It was Dionysus himself, working through their bodies, using their hands to enact his divine will. When possessed worshippers danced for hours without exhaustion, speaking in tongues, performing impossible feats of strength, it was the god's power manifesting through mortal flesh. This understanding of possession was central to Dionysian worship in a way that had no parallel in other Greek cults. Other gods might inspire you, might grant you gifts or favor, might even appear to you in visions or dreams. But Dionysus occupied you, took over your body, dissolved the boundary between human and divine by actually entering into your flesh. This direct, physical communion with the god was what made Dionysian religion so powerful and so threatening. The liberation offered by Dionysian ecstasy operated on multiple levels. Most obviously, it was liberation from physical pain and exhaustion. Ancient sources describe Maenads who could run for hours through mountains without tiring, who felt no pain when they struck themselves or were struck, who could tear apart large animals with their bare hands, feats impossible for normal women. The divine possession granted superhuman physical capabilities, temporarily freeing worshippers from bodily limitations. More importantly, it was liberation from social constraints. The women who became Maenads left behind their normal roles as wives, mothers, daughters, domestic laborers. They abandoned their homes, their children, their weaving looms and cooking fires. They went to the mountains and forests where men had no authority, where civilization's rules didn't apply. In their ecstatic rites, they inverted every social norm. They became loud instead of quiet, physically powerful instead of weak, sexually free instead of controlled, violent instead of gentle. For the duration of their possession, they experienced complete freedom from the oppressive constraints of Greek patriarchal society. It was also liberation from psychological burdens, from anxiety, fear, grief, the weight of self-consciousness and social judgment. When you stood outside yourself in ecstasy, all those burdens fell away. The pain of your life, whatever it was, ceased to matter because you temporarily ceased to be the person experiencing that pain. This psychological liberation was perhaps the most precious gift Dionysus offered to his followers, especially to women and slaves and others whose lives were difficult and constrained. The god offered liberation from reality itself, or at least from the ordinary, sober, rational perception of reality. In Dionysian consciousness, the world was transformed. Mountains became sacred spaces, filled with milk and honey. Animals could be torn apart and eaten raw. And this violence was not horrifying, but sacred. Impossible things became possible. The fixed, rational, ordered world dissolved into something fluid, magical, transformable. Reality became what you experienced it to be in your ecstasy, not what it was supposed to be according to rational understanding. But this liberation came at a cost, and the Greeks were acutely aware of the dangers. Divine madness, however liberating, was still madness. Those possessed by Dionysus lost control, lost their ability to make rational choices, potentially lost their humanity itself. The Maenads who tore apart Pentheus weren't responsible for their actions. They were possessed. They didn't know what they were doing. But they still killed him. Still tore their king apart with their hands. Still committed an act of terrible violence. Liberation from constraints meant liberation from all constraints, including moral ones. This was the terror and the promise of Dionysus. He offered complete freedom, but complete freedom includes freedom to destroy, to violate, to become something inhuman. The women who became Maenads gained power, but they gained it by surrendering their will to the god, by allowing him to possess them entirely. Was this liberation or enslavement? Was it empowerment or loss of self? The Greeks never fully resolved this tension. What they did recognize was that the forces Dionysus represented, ecstasy, madness, the dissolution of self, the longing to escape the constraints of ordinary existence, were real and powerful parts of human psychology that couldn't simply be ignored or suppressed. Greek culture valued rationality, order, self-control, the clear boundaries that define civilized life. But humans aren't entirely rational, and attempts to be perfectly controlled and orderly create their own psychological pressures. Dionysus offered a release valve, a ritualized way to experience temporary madness, ecstasy, and loss of control that made it possible to return to rational life afterward. Wine was the key that unlocked this experience. Not wine drunk moderately at dinner, but wine drunk to excess deliberately, sacramentally, as a way of ingesting the god. Through wine, through the altered consciousness it produced, worshippers could taste something of the ecstasy and liberation that Dionysus offered. And because wine was his gift, because winemaking itself was a divine mystery he had taught humanity, the entire cycle of grape cultivation, harvest, pressing, and fermentation became religious acts, ways of participating in the god's ongoing presence in the world. The grapevine itself became sacred, a manifestation of Dionysus in vegetable form. The vine dies back each winter and resurrects each spring, enacting the death and rebirth cycle associated with the god himself. Its fruit transforms from solid matter into liquid, from sweet juice into intoxicating wine, undergoing a mysterious change that ancients compared to the divine transformation. Tending vines, making wine, drinking wine, all of these were ways of engaging with Dionysus, of participating in his mysteries, of experiencing something of his power to transform, liberate, and dissolve the boundaries that normally kept the human and divine separate. The Maenads, women in sacred frenzy. Among all of Dionysus's followers, none were more famous or more frightening than the Maenads. Their name came from the Greek Maenades, meaning the raving ones or the mad ones, and they embodied the most extreme and unsettling aspects of Dionysian worship. These women, sometimes mythical nymphs, sometimes real human women possessed by the god, left their homes and families to dance in wild frenzy on mountaintops, performing acts that shocked and terrified the civilized Greek world. The mythological Maenads were the original followers of Dionysus, the nymphs who had nursed him on Mount Nysa and who accompanied him on his travels. They formed his core retinue along with satyrs and Silenus, following wherever the god went, always dancing, always drunk, always in a state of ecstatic possession. In art and literature, these Maenads were depicted as beautiful but terrifying, crowned with ivy, dressed in fawn skins, called knee brides, carrying the thyrsus, the fennel staff topped with a pine cone, sometimes with snakes wound around their arms and bodies. But maenads weren't just mythological figures. Real women participated in Dionysian rites that the Greeks called the orgia, the origin of our word orgies, though the Greek term didn't initially have the purely sexual connotation the modern word carries. These orgies were secret religious rituals, usually held every other winter, in which women left their cities and homes to spend several days on mountains, dancing, drinking wine, and entering states of religious ecstasy. The central ritual was called the oribazia, literally mountain walking. Groups of women, organized into religious bands called thiasoi, would climb into the mountains at night. They carried torches to light their way, musical instruments, especially the tympanum, handheld drum, ivy crowns, and thyrsi. Once on the mountain, they would dance for hours or days, working themselves into states of increasing frenzy. Ancient sources describe them whirling, leaping, throwing their heads back, screaming the ritual cry, "Uoi!" They danced until they collapsed, or until they achieved the state of ecstatic possession they sought. The music accompanying these rites was loud, rhythmic, and hypnotic. Drums beat steadily, providing a pulse that drove the dance. Cymbals clashed. The aulos, a double-piped wind instrument with a haunting, reedy sound, played repetitive melodies. The music, the movement, the darkness, the torchlit faces of the other dancers, the wine consumed in great quantities, the physical exhaustion, all of these combined to produce altered states of consciousness in which the boundaries of ordinary reality dissolved. In this state, according to ancient accounts, the maenads performed astonishing feats. They displayed superhuman strength, tearing apart large animals with their bare hands. They felt no pain, striking rocks with their thyrsi and bringing forth streams of water, milk, or honey. They handled snakes without being bitten. They nursed wild animals at their breasts, fawns, wolf cubs, treating predators as pets. The god possessed them completely, and through them he manifested his power over nature. The most disturbing aspect of Maenad rituals was sparagmos, the ritual tearing apart of living animals. In states of divine frenzy, the Maenads would catch wild animals, bulls, fawns, sometimes even lions according to some accounts, and tear them to pieces with their bare hands. This wasn't hunting, it was pure violence enacted in religious ecstasy. The animal, often associated with Dionysus himself, the bull was one of his sacred animals, was destroyed in a reenactment of the god's own mythic death. Following sparagmos came omophagia, the eating of raw flesh. The Maenads would consume parts of the animals they had torn apart, eating the raw, bloody meat in a communion feast. By consuming the flesh of the sacred animal, they believed they were literally ingesting the god's essence, taking Dionysus into their bodies in the most direct way possible. This was the ultimate sacrament of Dionysian worship, far more intense and visceral than the relatively tame Christian communion that would develop centuries later. These practices horrified proper Greek society. Eating raw meat was barbaric. Greeks cooked their food, distinguishing themselves from animals and savages. Women leaving their homes without male supervision was dangerous. Respectable Greek women were supposed to remain indoors, managing households, not roaming mountains at night. Women displaying physical strength and violence was deeply transgressive. Feminine virtue in Greek culture centered on gentleness, modesty, obedience. The Mohanads violated every social norm, becoming wild, powerful, free in ways that threatened the entire structure of Greek society. Yet the evidence suggests that these rituals actually happened. Inscriptions, reliefs, and literary sources from across the Greek world attest to women's Dionysian rites. Cities had official maenads, women chosen or elected to represent the community in these mountain rituals. The practices were regulated, given specific times and places, incorporated into civic religion, despite their threatening nature. Greek society couldn't eliminate these rituals, so it institutionalized them, containing them within religious festival contexts where their disruptive potential could be channeled safely. Why did women participate in these disturbing rites? The answer lies in what Dionysian worship offered them, and understanding this requires understanding the position of women in ancient Greek society. In normal Greek life, women of all but the lowest classes lived extremely constrained lives. They had little freedom of movement, no political power, no voice in public affairs. They were confined to domestic spaces, the gynaeconitis, the women's quarters of the house, their lives controlled by fathers, husbands, and social expectations. Their work, weaving, cooking, childcare, was necessary but undervalued, economically essential but granted no social prestige. Their primary worth lay in producing legitimate male heirs for their husbands, in being faithful wives, in managing households efficiently while remaining invisible to public life. Respectable women didn't appear in public except for specific religious festivals, and even then they were carefully supervised. They didn't attend symposia where men discussed philosophy and politics. They didn't participate in athletic competitions or military training. They didn't speak in the assembly or serve on juries. Their education was minimal, enough to manage a household, but not the philosophical and rhetorical training men received. They were, in many ways, prisoners of their own respectability, their value tied to virginity before marriage and absolute fidelity afterward, their voices silenced, their desires unspoken. The psychological burden of this must have been immense. Greek women were not passive acceptors of their lot. We see resistance and resentment in sources ranging from Aristophanes' comedies to fragments of women's poetry. But direct resistance was nearly impossible within the rigid patriarchal structure. Women who rejected their prescribed roles faced social destruction, exile, sometimes death. The system was designed to contain them, to channel their energy into acceptable domestic labor, to prevent them from imagining alternatives to their constrained existence. Dionysian worship offered an escape from all of this, however temporary. When women became Mahanads, they left domestic space for wild nature, abandoning the looms and cooking pots that defined their daily existence. The very act of going to mountains was transgressive. These were spaces controlled by men, where shepherds and hunters operated, where women had no business being. By going there anyway, women claimed physical territory that was supposed to be masculine, demonstrated that their bodies and movements couldn't be entirely contained by patriarchal geography. They left male authority behind. No husbands or fathers could control them when they were possessed by the god. The possession itself created a religious justification that superseded human authority. If Dionysus called you to his rites, you had to go. To refuse would be impious, would invite divine punishment. Husbands might object, but they were arguing with a god, not just with their wives. This gave women a form of agency that was otherwise unavailable, a religiously sanctioned excuse to leave their prescribed places and roles. They experienced their bodies not as reproductive vessels or objects of male sexual desire, but as instruments of divine power capable of incredible feats. The superhuman strength attributed to maenads in their frenzy, tearing apart bulls, running for hours without tiring, feeling no pain, whether literally true or mythologically enhanced, represented a fantasy of female physical power that inverted everyday reality. In normal life, women's bodies were weak, requiring male protection, capable only of domestic labor and childbirth. As monads, women's bodies became dangerous, powerful, autonomous. They felt collective female strength and solidarity, dancing together, supporting each other, sharing an experience that men couldn't access or control. The Theosoi, the bands of women who performed Dionysian rites together, created a female community outside the household structure. These weren't relationships mediated by men, sister-in-law, co-wife, but direct bonds between women based on shared religious experience. In these groups, women could form friendships, alliances, support networks that existed independently of male family structures. The psychological and spiritual appeal must have been enormous. For a few days every other year, women could escape the grinding constraints of their lives, could experience freedom, power, ecstasy, and direct communion with the divine. They could express rage, violence, and sexuality, all carefully suppressed in normal life, in ways that were not only permitted but sanctified. They could scream, run wild, tear things apart with their hands, dance until exhausted, drink until drunk. All the energies that daily life demanded they contain could be released in religious context. They could become something other than wives and mothers and daughters, could taste a form of existence entirely different from their daily reality, could be fully themselves in ways domestic life never permitted. The myths portrayed this liberation as dangerous, even deadly. Monads, in their frenzy, could kill those who opposed them, could mistake their own children for animals and tear them apart. The cautionary stories emphasized that female power unleashed was destructive, that women freed from male control became monsters. But the myths also showed that female power couldn't be denied, that attempting to suppress it led to worse violence than giving it ritual outlet. Better to have women go to the mountains every other year for controlled frenzy than to deny the rage and desires that civilization demanded they suppress. Modern scholars have debated how literally to take the ancient accounts of sparagmos and homophagia. Did women really tear apart animals and eat raw flesh? Or were these practices mythological elaborations, fears projected onto real but less extreme rituals? The evidence suggests that something real underlay the stories, even if the details were exaggerated. Women did go to mountains, did dance in religious frenzy, did perform rituals involving animals, and did enter states of altered consciousness in which they felt possessed by divine power. The maenads represented everything civilized Greek society feared about female nature unleashed: violence, sexuality, irrationality, refusal of domestic duty. But they also represented something Greek culture recognized as necessary, an outlet for all the forces that civilization tried to suppress, a ritualized space where boundaries could dissolve. where the order that normally structured life could be temporarily suspended. The Maenads were terrifying precisely because they were powerful, and their power came from the god who stood outside civilization's control, who represented all that was wild, ecstatic, and transformatively dangerous. In this sense, the Maenads were Dionysus's most perfect devotees. They embodied his gifts and his dangers. They experienced the liberation he offered, liberation from social constraints, from rational control, from fixed identity itself, and they paid the cost of that liberation, the loss of self, the violence of divine possession, the social stigma of being women who had stepped outside their proper place. They danced on mountain peaks in the torchlight, screaming their god's name, and for those moments of ecstasy, they were free in ways that most ancient women never experienced. That freedom might be terrifying, might be dangerous, might be temporary, but it was real, and thousands of women across the Greek world sought it in Dionysus's rites. Death and rebirth, the Zagreus mystery. Beneath the familiar stories of Dionysus's birth from Zeus's thigh lay another darker, stranger myth, the story of his first life and first death, the story of Zagreus. This myth was central to Orphism, a mystery religion that offered its initiates secret knowledge about the nature of the soul and promises of a blessed afterlife. In Orphic tradition, Dionysus wasn't simply twice born, he was twice lived, having died violently as an infant and being resurrected into a new existence. This death and rebirth cycle made Dionysus the only Olympian god who had truly experienced mortality, who had crossed the boundary between life and death and returned. And this gave him unique power as a guide for human souls on their own journeys through death and rebirth. The Orphic myth tells a story dramatically different from the standard account of Dionysus's birth. In this version, Zeus's partner was not the mortal Semele, but his own daughter Persephone, the queen of the underworld who spent half the year above ground with her mother Demeter and half below with her husband Hades. Zeus came to Persephone in the form of a serpent, in some versions literally transforming into a snake, in others the serpent shape being metaphorical. And from this union, Persephone conceived a son. This son was Zagreus, sometimes called the first Dionysus. Zeus loved the child deeply and had great plans for him. According to some versions, Zeus intended Zagreus to be his heir, the next ruler of the cosmos. The infant was given Zeus's thunderbolts to play with, extraordinary gifts for a baby. He sat on his father's throne, holding symbols of divine power. Some sources describe him as having small horns, a sign of his eventual role as bull god, even as an infant. But Hera, Zeus's wife and eternal enemy of his illegitimate children, couldn't tolerate the existence of this child born from incestuous union between father and daughter. She'd been unable to kill Dionysus in his second life, after his rebirth through Semele, but she could destroy him in his first. She incited the Titans, those primordial giants who had ruled the cosmos before Zeus overthrew them, to kill the divine child. The Titans came while the baby Zagreus sat on his father's throne. They didn't simply murder him. They planned to capture and destroy him completely. They distracted the infant with toys, 7 sacred toys that became central symbols in Orphic ritual. A mirror, spinning tops, knuckle bones used for gambling, a ball, apples, a bull roarer, a noise-making toy, and a comb. The mirror was the crucial one, while the baby Zagreus stared at his own reflection, Marveling at the image of himself, the Titan struck. They seized the child and tore him to pieces. The Greek word for this act was sparagmos, the same word used for the ritual tearing apart of animals in Dionysian worship. The Titans dismembered the infant god, separating his limbs from his body, tearing his divine flesh into fragments. But they didn't stop there. They took the pieces of his body and cooked them in a cauldron, boiling the divine flesh. Then they roasted the meat on spits over a fire. Finally, in the ultimate violation, they ate him, consuming the flesh and blood of Zeus's son, ingesting his divine essence, committing a crime that was both murder and sacrilege. The violence of this myth is shocking, even by the standards of Greek mythology, where violence was common. An infant god, barely old enough to sit upright, was torn apart, cooked, and eaten by the enemies of his father. The image of Titans boiling a baby in a cauldron, then roasting and consuming the pieces, is genuinely horrifying. But this violence wasn't gratuitous. It carried profound symbolic meaning for Orphic initiates. Athena, who in some versions had been spying on the Titans, managed to rescue one piece of the baby, his heart. She brought this heart to Zeus, who was devastated by his son's murder. In his rage, Zeus struck the Titans with lightning, burning them to ash. From these ashes, according to late Orphic sources, humanity was born. This meant that humans contained within themselves both the titanic element, the body inherited from the Titans, and the divine element, the soul, inherited from the fragments of Zagreus that the Titans had consumed before being destroyed. This anthropogony, this explanation of humanity's origin, was crucial to Orphic theology. It explained why humans were divided beings, part earthly and part divine, part mortal body and immortal soul. The titanic element pulled humans toward violence, corruption, and materialism. The divine Dionysian spark within them longed to escape bodily prison and reunite with the gods. Life became a struggle between these two natures, and death was not an end, but a potential liberation of the divine soul from titanic flesh. But what of Dionysus himself? The Titans had destroyed him, consumed him, left only his heart. How did he come to live again? Zeus took the heart that Athena had rescued and did one of two things, depending on which version of the myth you followed. In one version, Zeus ate the heart himself, swallowed his son's essence, and then conceived him anew when he slept with Semele, transferring the heart into her womb. In another version, Zeus put the heart in a potion and gave it to Semele to drink, so she became pregnant with the god reborn. Either way, the child born from Semele, the Dionysus whose story we know from mainstream Greek mythology, was literally a reincarnation. The same divine being who had been Zagreus now living a second life. The Dionysus who went to Thebes, who wandered foreign lands, who established his cult and took his place among the Olympians, was a resurrected god. He had experienced death, had been torn apart, had ceased to exist, and then had been brought back to life in a new body. This death and rebirth pattern made Dionysus unique among the Olympian gods. Zeus, Apollo, Athena, Artemis, none of them had ever died. They were simply divine, immortal, untouched by death. Heracles died, but was elevated to godhood afterward as a reward for his labors. But Dionysus alone had been a god, had died violently while divine, and had been resurrected to godhood again. He knew death from the inside, had crossed that boundary, and returned. This knowledge made him essential to Orphic religion. which was obsessed with death, the afterlife, and the soul's journey. Orphic initiates believed that through proper rituals, diet, and living, they could purify their souls during life, strengthening the divine Dionysian element within them and diminishing the titanic part. When they died, if they had achieved sufficient purity, they could escape the cycle of reincarnation and achieve a blessed afterlife. Dionysus, who had himself gone through death and rebirth, served as their guide and model for this process. Gold tablets found in graves across the Greek world, dating from the 5th century BCE onward, contain instructions for the dead in what appears to be Orphic tradition. These tablets told the deceased how to navigate the underworld, which paths to take, what to say to the guardians they would encounter. Some explicitly invoke Dionysus or Bacchus, his Roman name, asking the god for guidance and protection. The dead person would claim to be of divine origin, to contain that Dionysian spark that entitled them to special treatment in the afterlife. The Zagreus myth also explained the violent rituals of Dionysian worship. When Maeonads performed sparagmos, tearing apart animals, they were reenacting the god's own dismemberment by the Titans. When they consumed raw flesh in omophagia, they were reversing the Titan's crime, ingesting the god to achieve union with him rather than to destroy him. The sacrificial animals stood in for both Zagreus, who was torn apart, and Dionysus, who was reborn. By destroying and consuming it, worshippers participated in the god's death and rebirth cycle, dying symbolically to their old selves and being reborn in communion with the divine. The story resonated with the agricultural cycle that Dionysus represented. Grapevines die back in winter, appearing dead, cut back to bare stumps. In spring they resurrect, sending out new shoots, growing leaves and fruit, demonstrating the same death and rebirth pattern as the god himself. The grape harvest was itself a kind of sparagmos, the violent cutting down of the laden vines, the crushing of the fruit, the destruction necessary for transformation. From this destruction came wine, the divine blood of Dionysus, the means by which he manifested in the world after his bodily death. The myth also spoke to universal human experiences of death and continuity. Every person dies, but life continues. Parents die, children carry their essence forward. Bodies decay, but something, call it soul, memory, influence, persists. Dionysus embodied this paradox of death being real and yet not final, of destruction leading to new creation, of the individual perishing while the divine essence endures. Modern scholars have noted parallels between the Zagreus Dionysus myth and other dying and rising gods from the ancient Mediterranean and Near East. Egyptian Osiris was murdered and dismembered by his brother Set, then resurrected by Isis to become god of the underworld. Phoenician Adonis died and was resurrected annually, enacting the agricultural cycle. These and other similar myths point to a widespread religious pattern in which a god, usually male, usually young, usually associated with vegetation, dies violently and returns to life, bringing fertility, renewal, and the promise of continued existence after death. The early Christians recognized these parallels and struggled with them. Jesus Christ also died violently and was resurrected. Christianity also promised eternal life to believers. Christian communion involved ritually consuming the body and blood of the Savior. The similarities were obvious, and Christian theologians spent considerable energy arguing that Jesus was not just another dying and rising god like Dionysus, but something categorically different, the actual incarnation of divinity, rather than a pagan myth. But the structural parallels suggest that Christianity tapped into the same deep human needs and fears that Orphic Dionysian religion had addressed: the need to believe that death is not final, that some essence of ourselves persists, that divinity can enter into human experience and offer salvation. For the ancient Greeks who participated in Orphic mysteries, the Zagreus myth offered hope. Yes, they were part titanic, violent, mortal, bound to decay and death, but they were also part Dionysian, divine, immortal, capable of transcending death, if they could strengthen that divine spark through proper living and ritual. Dionysus was proof that death could be overcome, that dismemberment could be followed by restoration, that even the most complete destruction could be reversed by divine power. His story promised that the soul, though truly divine part of a person, could survive bodily death and achieve something beyond mortal existence, not immortality in the body, but immortality of essence, reunion with a divine source from which all life sprang. Birth of theater, sacred drama. Among Dionysus's many gifts to humanity, perhaps none had more lasting impact than theater. The Greeks invented drama as we know it: tragedy, comedy, theatrical performance, and they invented it as part of religious festivals honoring Dionysus. What we now consider secular entertainment began as sacred ritual, a way of enacting the god stories, experiencing transformation, and communing with divine power through performed narrative. The theater of Dionysus in Athens, where the greatest plays of ancient Greece premiered, was not just an entertainment venue but a religious sanctuary, where the god's presence was felt in every performance. The origins of theater lay in the Dithram, a choral hymn sung and danced in honor of Dionysus. These dithrams were performed by groups of men, and sometimes boys, often 50 strong, moving in circular patterns while singing songs about the god's birth, his travels, his gifts to humanity. The performances were ecstatic, rhythmic, intoxicating in their repetitive movements and melodies. They created a collective experience of unity with the god, with participants temporarily losing their individual identities in the shared voice of the chorus. According to tradition, a poet named Thespis made a revolutionary innovation in the middle of the 6th century BCE. He stepped out of the chorus and began to speak as an individual character, responding to the chorus's songs with spoken dialogue. This created the possibility of a dramatic representation. Someone could embody Dionysus or another figure from myth, could perform their actions, could show rather than merely tell their stories. With this innovation, theater was born. We still call actors thespians, after this legendary first performer. The innovation proved so popular that Athens' tyrant, Pisistratos, incorporated dramatic competitions into the city Dionysia, the major spring festival honoring Dionysus. Beginning around 534 BCE, poets competed to present the best dramatic performance in honor of the god. 3 poets would be selected each year to present 4 plays, each 3 tragedies and a satyr play, a shorter comic piece featuring satyrs, those half-goat companions of Dionysus. A panel of judges, chosen by lot from among the citizens, would award prizes to the best productions. The city Dionysia became Athens' most important festival, lasting for several days each spring. It began with a procession in which the wooden cult statue of Dionysus Eleutherius, Dionysus the Liberator, was carried from his temple to the theater of Dionysus. Citizens made sacrifices, poured libations, performed preliminary rituals. Then came days of dramatic performances, with thousands of Athenians gathering to watch the latest works by their greatest poets. The theater itself was a marvel of religious architecture and acoustic engineering. Built into the southern slope of the Acropolis Hill, it could hold between 15 and 17,000 spectators, a significant portion of Athens' adult male citizenry. The seating curved around a circular orchestra, the dance floor where the chorus performed. Behind the orchestra was the Skene, a building that served as backdrop and allowed actors to change masks and costumes. The physical arrangement placed the audience in intimate proximity to the performance, creating a shared ritual experience rather than passive entertainment. Three of the greatest tragedians in human history, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, premiered their works at this theater. Aeschylus's Oresteia, perhaps the greatest trilogy ever written, explores themes of justice, vengeance, and the transformation of blood feud into civic law. Sophocles' Oedipus Rex and Antigone examine fate, knowledge, power, and moral responsibility with psychological depth that still resonates today. Euripides' plays, including the Bacchae, about Dionysus himself, pushed boundaries of convention, questioning traditional beliefs, and exploring uncomfortable truths about human nature. All of these masterworks were religious offerings to Dionysus. When Athenians watched Oedipus discover his identity, or Antigone defy the state, or Pentheus be torn apart by Maenads, they were participating in Dionysian worship. The god was present in the theater, his cult statue positioned where he could watch the performances. The plays weren't just stories. They were ritual reenactments that created sacred experiences for both performers and audience. Why did theater develop as part of Dionysian worship specifically? The answer lies in what Dionysus represented and what theater accomplishes. Dionysus was the god of masks, of transformation, of stepping outside your normal identity. Theater required exactly these things. Actors wore masks, literally putting on different faces and voices. They embodied characters other than themselves, temporarily becoming kings, heroes, gods, monsters. They performed transformations of identity before an audience, enacting the same dissolution of fixed self that Dionysian ecstasy produced through wine and dance. Theater also created a form of controlled, communal ecstasy. The plays moved audiences emotionally, made them weep and rage and fear, took them out of their ordinary states of mind into intense identification with the characters on stage. This emotional transportation was a kind of possession, a temporary loss of self in the experience of the drama. Aristotle famously argued that tragedy provided catharsis, a purging of emotions, but we might equally say it provided a form of Dionysian ecstasy, standing outside oneself through vicarious participation in the performed stories. The content of tragedies also aligned with Dionysian themes. Tragedies almost always involved suffering, death, transformation, and often the conflict between human will and divine power. Characters were driven by forces beyond their control, possessed by fates or curses or divine madness, forced to undergo terrible transformations. King Oedipus discovers his identity has been a lie. Agamemnon is murdered by his wife. Ajax goes mad and slaughters sheep thinking they're his enemies. Pentheus is torn apart by his mother. These transformations, dismemberments, discoveries of horrible truths, losses of identity, all echoed Dionysian themes of destruction, transformation, death, and rebirth. The comic playwright Aristophanes competed at this Dionysia as well, presenting plays like The Frogs, The Birds, and Lysistrata. Comedy also had religious significance, though different from tragedy. If tragedy explored the serious, painful side of transformation and divine power, comedy explored the absurd, sexual, irreverent side. Comic plays featured enormous phalluses, vulgar jokes, wild costumes, impossible situations, political satire, and fantastic transformations. They celebrated license, excess, and the overturning of normal social orders, all very Dionysian qualities. During Dionysian festivals, social rules relaxed. Criticism of leaders was permitted. Obscenity was acceptable. Comedy channeled this licensed transgression into performed art. Satyr plays, performed after the serious tragedies, featured choruses of satyrs, those perpetually drunken, sexually aroused companions of Dionysus. These plays told mythological stories, but in comic, often bawdy fashion, bringing levity after the emotional intensity of tragedy. The satyrs represented the most uninhibited aspects of Dionysian worship: constant intoxication, sexual license, animal nature barely contained in quasi-human form. Their presence reminded audiences that Dionysus presided over both sides of human experience, the tragic and the comic, the refined and the crude, the very civilized theater performance, and the wild mountain rites. Theater achieved something remarkable. It tamed Dionysian ecstasy, channeling it into civic ritual. Instead of maenads tearing apart animals on mountains, Athenians gathered in an organized theater to watch performed representations of mythological violence. Instead of individual possession and madness, audiences experienced controlled emotional catharsis through identification with characters. Instead of breaking down social order, theater reinforced civic identity. This was an Athenian institution, funded by wealthy citizens, attended by the demos, celebrating Athens' cultural achievements. Yet something of the dangerous, transformative power remained. Great theater still transports us, makes us lose ourselves in the story, creates emotional experiences that change how we see the world. Actors still put on masks, metaphorical if not literal, and temporarily become other people. Audiences still gather in the dark to share emotional experiences that take them out of ordinary consciousness. The sacred origins of theater persist in secular form, and Dionysus remains its patron god, even if we no longer acknowledge him. The theatrical festivals did more than just honor Dionysus. They helped define Athenian identity and spread Greek culture across the Mediterranean. When Greek colonies held their own dramatic festivals, when Roman playwrights adapted Greek tragedies, when Renaissance dramatists rediscovered classical theater, they were continuing traditions that began as religious worship of the god of wine, madness, and transformation. Shakespeare, Racine, and every playwright since owed a debt to the Dionysian festivals, where drama was born. Today, when we go to theater, movies, or even watch television dramas, we're participating in cultural practices that trace directly back to the theater of Dionysus. We still seek emotional transportation, still want to lose ourselves in stories, still use performed narratives to explore difficult truths about human existence. We no longer pour libations to Dionysus before the show or consider the experience religious worship. But the psychological and social functions remain the same. Theater creates a space where normal rules are suspended, where we can vicariously experience extremes of emotion in situations, where transformation and catharsis become possible. These are Dionysian gifts, even if we've forgotten the god who gave them. Sacred rites and Dionysian mysteries beyond the public festivals and theatrical performances lay another level of Dionysian worship. The mysteries, secret rites available only to initiates who had undergone specific rituals and sworn oaths of silence about what they experienced. The Dionysian mysteries were among several mystery cults in ancient Greece, the Eleusinian mysteries being the most famous, but they had distinctive characteristics shaped by the god they honored. While we know frustratingly little about the exact practices, initiates kept their oaths of secrecy well. We can piece together some picture of what these mysteries involved and what they promised. The word mysteries comes from the Greek mysterion, related to mystes, and initiate, and myein, to close the eyes or mouth. Mysteries were religious experiences that couldn't be fully communicated in words, that had to be directly experienced to be understood. They involved secret knowledge, special rituals, and promises of benefits both in this life and after death. Unlike public religion with its open sacrifices and prayers, mystery cults were exclusive, requiring initiation, and they promised transformation of those who participated. Dionysian mysteries were closely connected to Orphic religion, though not identical to it. Both centered on Dionysus, or the Dionysus Zagreus figure. Both involved ideas of death and rebirth. Both promised blessed afterlife to initiates. But Orphic religion was more ascetic, prescribing strict rules about diet and behavior, while Dionysian mysteries embraced the god's more indulgent aspects: wine, ecstasy, possession. Some scholars suggest they were different branches of similar religious impulses. Others see them as overlapping traditions that borrowed from each other. Initiation into the Dionysian mysteries involved several stages. The first level might be relatively accessible, attending certain festivals, participating in public processions, learning basic mythology and symbolism. But deeper levels required personal commitment and specific rituals. Candidates had to be sponsored by existing initiates, undergo purification rites, swear oaths, and finally participate in the central mystery ritual, the details of which we can only guess at. Based on ancient accounts and comparisons with other mystery cults, Dionysian initiation likely involved several elements. First, purification, ritual bathing, perhaps fasting, ceremonial cleansing to prepare the candidate spiritually, and then instruction in sacred stories and symbols, learning the myths of Dionysus, understanding the meaning of sacred objects and practices, then the central ritual itself, possibly involving dramatic reenactment of Dionysus's death and rebirth, ritual consumption of wine and possibly sacred foods, induction into states of ecstasy through dancing, music, and intoxication, revelation of sacred objects, which might include the phallus, agricultural implements, or other symbols, and experience of possession or communion with the god in some direct way. The experience was designed to transform the initiate. You entered as an ordinary person. You emerged having died symbolically. and been reborn, having experienced direct contact with the divine, having received secret knowledge that changed your understanding of existence. You were now a mystis, one who had closed their eyes to ordinary reality and opened them to sacred truth. What did the mysteries promise? Most fundamentally, they promised a better afterlife. While ordinary Greeks expected to become powerless shades in Hades' gloomy underworld, initiates into mystery cults were promised something better, either escape from the cycle of reincarnation in Orphic influenced traditions, or a blessed existence in special sections of the underworld reserved for the initiated. Gold tablets found in graves show initiates claiming special status in death, describing themselves as children of the gods, entitled to drink from the pool of memory rather than the river of forgetfulness. The mysteries also promise transformation in this life. Initiates reported experiencing profound changes in consciousness, feeling they had transcended their ordinary selves, achieved union with the divine, understood truths that couldn't be communicated to the uninitiated. The psychological impact of these experiences could be powerful and lasting. Having undergone ritual death and rebirth, having experienced ecstatic communion with a god, having been accepted into a special community of fellow initiates. These gave meaning, purpose, and spiritual fulfillment that ordinary religion might not provide. The festival calendar of Dionysian worship included several major celebrations in Athens and throughout the Greek world. The Anthesteria, held in late February or early March, was one of the oldest. It lasted 3 days and celebrated the new wine. The first day, Pythogia, involved opening the wine jars from the previous fall's fermentation and tasting the new vintage, a moment of great anticipation. The second day, Coes, featured drinking contests and ritual revelry, with the wine flowing freely. But it also had a darker aspect. It was a day when ghosts of the dead were believed to rise and walk among the living, requiring special precautions. The third day, Kaitroi, was dedicated to the chthonic underworld gods and the dead, with offerings made and then the spirits firmly sent back below. The Linnaea, held in midwinter, January, was sacred to Dionysus Linnaeus and featured both dramatic competitions, especially comedies, and secret rites for women. The rural Dionysia, celebrated in December in villages throughout Attica, involved processions with phalluses, crude songs and jokes, performances of plays, and general festivity. These rural festivals retained more of the raw, body, fertility-focused aspects of Dionysian worship. All of these festivals shared certain elements: wine consumption, often to excess, license to speak and act in ways normally forbidden, temporary suspension of social hierarchies, celebration of fertility and natural abundance, and acknowledgement of death and the underworld alongside celebration of life and growth. They recognized that Dionysus presided over both sides of existence: growth and decay, joy and sorrow, life and death, civilization and wildness. The secret rites remained secret. Ancient authors who wrote about them either claimed ignorance or deliberately obscured details. Modern scholars debate endlessly about what actually happened in the most sacred ceremonies. This uncertainty is itself significant. The mysteries worked partly because they were mysterious, because they promised knowledge that couldn't be obtained any other way, because they created an exclusive community defined by shared secrets and transformative experiences. What we can say is that the Dionysian mysteries addressed deep human needs, the need to transcend mundane existence, to experience something ecstatic and transformative, to believe that death is not the end, to find meaning beyond the ordinary structures of society and life. They offered direct encounter with the divine, not mediated by temples and priests, but experienced in the body, in altered consciousness, in ritual that transformed participants. This directness, this promise of immediate access to sacred power, made the mysteries appealing despite, or because of, their exclusive nature. Symbols, companions, and sacred objects, Dionysus surrounded himself with a rich iconography of symbols and companions, each carrying layers of meaning that helped define his nature and his gifts to humanity. Understanding these symbols and attendant figures reveals the complexity of Dionysian religion and the many aspects of existence he governed. The thyrsus was the most recognizable symbol of Dionysian worship. This staff, made from a fennel stalk, was topped with a pine cone and wound with ivy or grapevines. The thyrsus looked harmless. Fennel is a hollow, lightweight plant, but in myth it possessed supernatural power. When monads struck rocks with their thyrsi, springs of water, milk, or honey appeared. When they touched animals or people with it, those touched became possessed by divine madness. In art, Dionysus himself always carries a thyrsus, and his followers are recognized by carrying them. The thyrsus represented the paradoxical nature of Dionysian power, outwardly soft and harmless, but containing hidden force. The fennel stalk with its hollow core could conceal fire, as Prometheus used a fennel stalk to steal fire from the gods. The pine cone was both a fertility symbol and, with its hard scales, a weapon. Ivy was sacred to Dionysus, remaining green through winter when other plants died, symbolizing endurance and eternal life. The thyrsus combined natural elements, vegetable, resinous, vine, into an instrument of divine power that could create or destroy, depending on the god's will. Ivy crowned the heads of Dionysus and his followers, this plant that climbed walls and trees, that stayed green when others withered, that could strangle what it grew on, perfectly embodied Dionysian qualities. It was both beautiful and dangerous, life-giving and parasitic, present year-round, unlike the seasonal grapevine. Wreaths of ivy identified worshippers during festivals, marking them as under the god's protection and possession. The leopard, or panther, Greeks didn't clearly distinguish, was sacred to Dionysus, and he was often depicted riding one or surrounded by them. These dangerous, beautiful wildcats represented untamed nature, the predatory power lurking beneath civilization's surface. That Dionysus could ride them showed his mastery over wild forces, his ability to channel and direct what was fierce and uncontrollable. The leopard's spotted coat became a sacred vestment. My Anads sometimes wore leopard skins as they did fawn skins. The bull was another crucial sacred animal. Dionysus was called bull-faced and bull-horned, and some myths described him appearing as a bull or having bull-like features. Bulls represented male fertility, power, and untamed aggression. In mysteries and rituals, bulls were sacrificed to Dionysus, torn apart in sparagmos rites, their raw flesh consumed. The bull embodied the god's dangerous masculine power, sexual, violent, overwhelming, that complemented the feminine ecstasy of his maenads. Wine cups, particularly the cantharos, a deep cup with high handles, were emblems of the god who gave wine to humanity. In art, Dionysus often holds a cantharos, sometimes drinking from it, sometimes offering it to others. The cup symbolized the gift of wine, the communion with the god through drinking, the vessel that contained transformation in liquid form. To drink from Dionysus's cup was to ingest his essence, to take divine madness willingly into yourself. The grapevine and its fruit were obviously central. Grape clusters in art signified Dionysus's presence. Vineyards were sacred spaces. The transformation of grapes into wine through crushing and fermentation was itself a sacred mystery, an alchemical change that produced something greater than its ingredients. Every stage of viticulture, planting, pruning, harvesting, pressing, fermenting, had religious significance as participation in the god's ongoing creative work. Dionysus traveled with an entourage of supernatural companions. The satyrs were half man, half goat, creatures with permanent erections, perpetual drunkenness, and insatiable sexual appetites. They represented the animalistic side of human nature, the barely contained desires that civilization tried to suppress. In art and literature, they chased nymphs, got drunk, played music, and generally embodied masculine sexuality and appetite at their most shameless. Yet they were also musicians and dancers, companions to the god, permitted behaviors that humans would be punished for. Silenus, sometimes called Silenos, was the old satyr, Dionysus's foster father and constant companion, typically depicted as pot-bellied, balding, riding a donkey, or stumbling drunk. Silenus looked like a joke figure, but he possessed profound wisdom, knowledge of the past and future, understanding that came from his intimate connection to nature and to the god. When captured and forced to reveal his wisdom, Silenus famously declared that the best thing for humans would be never to have been born, and second best, to die young. A dark truth hidden in comic appearance. The nymphs who were Dionysus's nurses and early companions remained part of his retinue, distinct from the Maenads in being immortal nature spirits rather than possessed human women. These nymphs of mountains, springs, and forests represent the wild, feminine power of nature itself, predating civilization, indifferent to human concerns, beautiful and dangerous. They danced with the satyrs, cared for Dionysus, and manifested the god's connection to wild places. Pan, the goat-footed god of shepherds and wild nature, was in some traditions Dionysus's son, conceived with Penelope or some nymph. Pan inherited his father's association with wild nature, music. His pipes were named after him, and the ability to cause panic, sudden, irrational fear. Like Dionysus, Pan lived on boundaries between civilization and wilderness, between human and animal, between sanity and madness. The masks worn in theater were symbols of Dionysian transformation. Even when not performing, Dionysus was sometimes depicted as simply a mask hanging on a pole, reducing the god to his essence as the power of transformation and assumption of different identities. Theatrical masks allowed actors to become other people, to wear other faces literally, enacting the dissolution of fixed identity that was central to Dionysian religion. The pine cone atop the thyrsus carried its own symbolism, simultaneously masculine, phallic shape, and feminine when opened, resembling female anatomy, simultaneously seed-bearing, creation, and hard-scaled, protection, both decorative and potentially weaponized. It represented the union of opposites that Dionysus embodied. These symbols and companions weren't just decorative. They were theological statements about what Dionysus represented. The wild animals showed his power over nature, the satyrs his connection to animal instinct, the grapevine his gift of transformation through wine, the Dionysus his hidden power in seemingly harmless forms, the masks his role as god of identity change. Together they painted a picture of a deity who presided over growth and decay, wildness and cultivation, reason and madness, masculine and feminine, human and animal, civilization and nature. Understanding these symbols helps us understand the experiences of ancient worshippers. When monads danced with Circe and ivy crowns, they weren't just using props. They were wielding sacred objects that connected them to divine power. When initiates saw the Contheros, or the sacred phallus revealed in mysteries, these weren't arbitrary items but dense symbols loaded with meaning. When theater audiences saw masks, they recognized Dionysian transformation made visual. The entire symbolic vocabulary of Dionysian worship reinforced the same themes: transformation, boundary crossing, the dissolution of fixed categories, the power hidden in apparent weakness, the divine madness that lurks just beneath civilization's surface. Further, from Greece to Rome, Bacchus and beyond, when Roman culture encountered Greek religion, most Greek gods were easily assimilated, identified with existing Roman deities, or simply adopted wholesale. Dionysus underwent this process, but also experienced dramatic conflict, suppression, and transformation before eventually being absorbed into Roman state religion. The story of Dionysus Bacchus in Rome reveals both the appeal of his ecstatic worship and the threat it posed to social order. The Romans called him Bacchus, Latin Bacchus from the Greek Bacchos, one of Dionysus's epithets, or identified him with their native god, Liber Pater, the free father, an old Italian deity of wine and fertility. The association made sense. Both were wine gods, both connected to freedom and liberation, both worshipped with festivities involving drinking and loosened social constraints. Roman Bacchus inherited Greek Dionysian mythology, iconography, and ritual practices, becoming essentially the same god under a different name. Bacchic worship spread throughout Italy and into Rome itself during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. Mystery cults sacred to Bacchus appeared, offering initiation, secret rites, and promises of blessed afterlife. These bacchanalia, as the Romans called them, followed patterns similar to Greek Dionysian mysteries, but adapted to Roman context. They attracted followers particularly among women, slaves, and lower classes, those with limited power and constrained lives who found liberation in ecstatic worship. In 186 BCE, a scandal erupted that led to violent suppression of the Bacchanalia. According to the historian Livy, writing much later, a young man named Ebutius brought accusations about the secret rites to Roman authorities. He claimed that Bacchic initiations involved not just wine drinking and ecstatic dancing, but sexual orgies, criminal conspiracies, murders, and perversion of every kind. Men copulated with men, breaking Roman taboos about masculine conduct. Murders were committed during the rites with screams and drums covering the sounds. Conspiracies against the state were plotted in the secret meetings. Thus, the Bacchanalia, according to these accusations, had become covers for criminal activity and moral corruption that threatened Rome itself. The Roman Senate investigated and was horrified by what it claimed to discover. It issued the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus, a decree that severely restricted Bacchic worship. No Bacchic meeting could occur without explicit permission from the Senate. Groups could have no more than 5 members. No common treasury could be kept. No priest or priestess could officiate. Violation of these restrictions carried the death penalty. According to Livy, thousands were arrested, and many were executed or imprisoned. Modern scholars debate what actually happened. Did the Bacchanalia really involve the criminal excesses Livy describes, or were the accusations exaggerated, driven by elite male anxiety about secret religious groups that gave power to women and lower classes? The truth probably lies somewhere between. Bacchic worship did involve ecstatic rites, drinking, sexual license, and temporary suspension of normal social hierarchies. Whether it involved actual crimes is less clear, but it certainly involved behaviors and forms of social organization that threatened traditional Roman structures of power. Roman religion was heavily regulated and tied to state authority. The Senate controlled which gods could be worshipped. Appointed priests oversaw major festivals. Religious practice reinforced social hierarchy and political power. Mystery cults, exclusive, secret, offering direct access to divine power without state mediation, challenged this system. Bacchic mysteries particularly threatened Roman patriarchal order by empowering women and slaves, allowing them to gather without supervision, creating alternative authority structures centered on ecstatic experience rather than social status. The suppression of the Bacchanalia wasn't really about moral corruption. It was about control. The Roman state couldn't tolerate religious organizations that operated outside its authority, that created loyalty to something other than Rome, that allowed marginalized groups to experience power and freedom. The violence of the suppression, thousands arrested, many killed, demonstrated how seriously Rome took this threat. But Bacchic worship wasn't eliminated. It was regulated, domesticated, brought under state control. The god himself was incorporated into official Roman religion, identified with Liber and given his own festivals and temples. The wild, threatening aspects of his cult were tamed, channeled into acceptable forms. Roman Bacchus became less the foreign god of dangerous ecstasy and more a conventional deity of wine, festivity, and agricultural abundance. The Romans also developed different interpretations of Bacchic mythology. Philosophical schools, particularly Neoplatonists, read the myths allegorically. Bacchus's dismemberment and resurrection represented the soul's descent into material existence and eventual return to divine unity. His drunken followers symbolized souls intoxicated by material pleasures. His triumphal return from India represented the soul's journey back to enlightenment. These intellectual interpretations stripped away the threatening social elements, making Bacchic mythology safe for educated Romans. Roman art depicted Bacchus in ways both continuous with and different from Greek models. The drunken, soft-bodied, often effeminate Bacchus became popular in sculpture and painting. Sarcophagi frequently featured Bacchic scenes, the god's triumph, his followers dancing, satyrs and maenads reveling. These images associated Bacchus with pleasure, celebration, eternal festivity in the afterlife. Death became not something to fear, but entry into permanent Bacchic celebration. As Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, early Christian writers attacked pagan cults generally, and Bacchic worship particularly. They condemned the drunkenness, sexual license, and what they saw as demonic possession, Christian interpretation of ecstatic states, but they also couldn't help noticing parallels between Bacchic and Christian practices. Both involved ritual consumption of divine flesh and blood. Both promised resurrection and eternal life. Both centered on a God who died and returned to life. Both offered salvation through direct communion with the divine. Some early Christians worried about these parallels. Were pagan mystery cults satanic imitations of Christian truth? Had demons stolen Christian doctrines and implanted them in false religions? Or had God prepared humanity for Christ through these earlier myths? Different Christian theologians answered differently, but all recognized that something in Dionysian Bacchic religion had touched truths that Christianity also proclaimed. By late antiquity, as Christianity became dominant and pagan worship was suppressed, Bacchus worship faded but didn't entirely disappear. Rural areas maintained old festivals under Christian disguise. Carnival celebrations before Lent retained Bacchic elements of excess, masking social inversion, and license transgression. Wine remained symbolically important, now as Christ's blood rather than Dionysus's, but the transformation of grape into sacred liquid continued. The Renaissance rediscovered classical mythology with enthusiasm. Artists painted and sculpted Bacchus frequently. Caravaggio's sensuous young Bacchus, Titian's Bacchus, and Ariadne. Countless Bacchic scenes on canvases across Europe. Poets invoked him as symbol of artistic inspiration, intoxication, and liberation from constraint. Bacchus became part of educated culture's classical vocabulary, though divorced from actual religious practice. Modern psychology, particularly following Nietzsche and Freud, rediscovered Dionysian themes as universal human patterns. Nietzsche's contrast between Apollonian order and Dionysian ecstasy in The Birth of Tragedy made Dionysus represent fundamental drives toward chaos, passion, and dissolution of boundaries that complement reason and order. Freud's concept of the ID, those uncontrollable desires beneath consciousness, echoed Dionysian themes. Jung found Dionysian archetypes in the collective unconscious. Today, Dionysus Bacchus remains culturally present, even if not literally worshipped. Wine culture retains sacred dimensions. Oenophiles speak of wine in terms approaching religious devotion. Festivals and carnival retain Bacchic license and social inversion. Theater still begins as his gift to humanity. The desire to lose oneself in ecstasy, whether through intoxication, music, dance, or other means, remains fundamental to human experience. Modern attempts to rationally control and suppress these desires often fail as spectacularly as King Pentheus's attempts to suppress Dionysian worship, the foreign god who arrived in Greece thousands of years ago, who taught humanity to make wine, who offered liberation through madness and transformation through possession, who died and was reborn, who became god of theater and mysteries and ecstasy. This god left marks on human culture that persist, despite the disappearance of literal belief. Whenever we lose ourselves in performance, celebration, or intoxication, whenever we seek transformation beyond rational consciousness, whenever we celebrate fertility and mourn death knowing both are part of eternal cycles, we participate in patterns that Dionysus first embodied. The twice-born god still lives, not in temples or through sacrifices, but in the eternal human need for experiences that take us beyond ourselves. Conclusion. And so we reach the end of our journey through the myths and mysteries of Dionysus, the twice-born god, the foreign deity who came from outside to shake the foundations of Greek civilization, the lord of wine and madness who taught humanity that sometimes we must lose ourselves completely to find what truly matters. From his impossible birth, torn from his dying mother and sewn into his father's thigh, through his wandering years of madness and discovery, through his establishment of ecstatic rites that both liberated and terrified, through his death as Zagreus and rebirth as eternal Dionysus, through his gift of theater to humanity, and his promises of blessed afterlife to initiates, we've explored a god who was never simple, never safe, never entirely comfortable within civilization's boundaries. Dionysus reminds us that human existence isn't only about rational order, civilized behavior, and controlled emotions. We also need ecstasy, transformation, the dissolution of the rigid boundaries that constrain us. We need wine and celebration, theater and performance, moments when normal rules don't apply, experiences that take us outside ourselves. We need to acknowledge the wild, irrational, ecstatic dimensions of human nature rather than pretending they don't exist. The Maenads teach us that suppressing these forces doesn't eliminate them, it makes them more dangerous. Better to give them ritual outlet, sacred space, controlled release. If you've enjoyed this exploration of Dionysus, the god of wine, madness, ecstasy, death, and rebirth, please like this video and subscribe to the Mythos Deep Dive. Your support helps us continue bringing you these deep dives into the fascinating world of Greek mythology, where gods and humans struggle with eternal questions about existence, transformation, and what it means to be alive. Share this with anyone interested in ancient religion, theater history, the psychology of ecstasy, or the enduring power of myth. Let us know in the comments which aspect of Dionysian worship you found most fascinating, or which god or hero you'd like us to explore next. And remember, whether you drink wine or not, whether you believe in ancient gods or not, the patterns Dionysus represents, transformation, boundary crossing, the need for ecstasy and release, remain part of human experience. May you find your own forms of sacred liberation, your own moments of standing outside yourself, your own celebrations of the eternal cycles of death and rebirth that Dionysus embodies. Stay curious, my friends, and may the twice-born god watch over your transformations